Okay, now in this second video, let's pick up where we left off and look at getting data points themselves. So we've kind of looked at the different types of points, the different types of equipment, buildings. Now let's look at getting actual points themselves. So here we're going to look at a function called point selector. This is just like we saw in previous videos, where point selector allows us to specify certain types of tags that we want to look for. Maybe buildings, different ways to query this sort of data model in itself, and use the query, build this query with these attributes to select various types of points. So we'll look at an example here where we're going to build a query where we want to look at power, let's say real power, instantaneous power, and zone temperature. And we want to look at just one of the buildings, building 385. We're going to use those filters to select points using the query. What we end up with is a list of, a dictionary that has various elements inside of it, the buildings, the equipment types, the point types, and then the points themselves. So these numbers here indicate or represent a certain actual data point in the system that can be queried to collect time series data. So, just getting those 7 points right there, you can then collect the actual sensor data information themselves from that actual point, from these 7 data points, by querying get points by IDs. So those are, you just want those 7 points. You can see here the metadata about those points, what building it's from, when it was first and last updated. So what time range essentially the data is from. We talked about that last time where we actually visualized that. What's the name of the point, description, basically all the different attributes about that point type. So lots of good detailed information here that allows you to understand and query the time series, which we'll look at in the next set of videos coming up later. So we want to, let's add this information to our equipment data that we have. So sometimes exploration of metadata is sometimes looking at how to find these different snapshots and sometimes merge those snapshots of data into, extended data sets. So we loaded this, we use the get all equipment function. It takes maybe a little time to run to query all the different equipment in the entire data set. Here you can see that once we get all the pieces of equipment in the entire data set, we're looking at just the first 5 rows here because we use .head. But let's also look at the number, the amount of equipment that we have here from .info. So looking at $.info of this data frame, you're going to see there's actually 5,900 pieces of equipment in the hackathon data set. So quite a fair number of units and data points that go along with that. So we have the ID for the equipment in the first column. We also have that column in our sensor metadata. So if we look at our sensor metadata, we can see that over here we have the last column is equipment ID. We can basically, here's also the .info version of it. So the 19th column, the 20th column is this equipment ID. So in order to, look at these at your point list alongside the information you have from your equipment list, you can use the pandas.merge function, which allows us to use these 2 data frames, metadata and equipment. We're going to merge them based on the data that's available on the left data set, which is the sensor metadata. So if you can dive into the .merge documentation to learn more about this. In this case, we're going to use the metadata data frame as the sort of guide. We're going to merge based on the building ID and the equipment ID. And then on the right from the equipment, we're going to look at the building ID and then the ID of the piece of equipment itself. So when we do that merge, we get this data frame called merge.info, which actually has, it has the combined metadata from both of these data frames that might be interesting to look at in the context of your 7 points and then the equipment that goes with them. So basically helping you expand that data set even bigger. So other things that we can do with this information, the way that we've navigated the API, we now are comfortable with looking at the different types of attributes that you can get from the API. Let's do a little bit more exploration. So let's actually look at all the points. So it actually takes a little while for this get all points function to run. I cut that part out of this video so you didn't have to wait for it, but you'll have to wait for it when you run it on your own machine. What we end up with here when we do get all points is we end up with a data frame that has all the actual points in the hackathon. So we can see right now we're only looking at .head, which is only the first 5 of those points. But if we look at .info, we're going to notice that there are 44,000 total points. So this is a pretty large data set, right? This is hundreds of buildings, thousands of pieces of equipment, and tens of thousands of points attached to those equipment. So really a massive data set for this hackathon that you can use. So once again, like we could use our points list that we just created here. We can merge it with buildings metadata. So let's get all the buildings metadata. There's only 229 rows instead of 44,000 rows, so that's a little bit easier. We want to look at our buildings ID and name, and we want to merge, let's say we want to merge our point list with our buildings ID data set so that we can get basically an extended data frame that includes the metadata from both the point list and the buildings point list. So this is, we do this because in the back end of the system, you don't want to have kind of these duplicates. You create these sort of two-dimensional panels of data that when we query them separately, they're interesting, but when we merge them, we kind of extend that data set. It's not the most efficient way to store the data, but it might be quite useful for us on the back end or on basically on what we're doing. So we can do that. Let's go ahead and merge this point list in a way that merges the point list with the buildings data frame. We're going to use on the left the building ID, on the right the ID, and we want to add these suffixes. So it's either from the point, or if there is a duplicate between column names, you would put underscore point if it's from the point data frame and underscore BDG if it's from the building database. So here you can see that what we end up with is 27 total columns. We can add also data from the equipment database. If we look at that again, we can see the different types of metadata we get from equipment. Let's say we want to merge, once again, this time we're going to merge our points database with our equipment database like we did with our buildings data set. And we do the same type of thing where we merge them using the different attributes of the .merge function of pandas. So this just gives us a lot of ways to extract data and to merge these data sets and when we get into the visualization in a bit, it'll become more obvious maybe why you would want to do this. So you might have duplicate columns when you make these merges, so you can use the .drop function to understand how to remove columns that you don't need anymore. It's not always necessary to do that, but if you want to, you can. You can create percentages, so you can transform certain columns by, not transform into percentages. You want to look for missing values. So in this case, we're looking at our metadata. What are the columns that have missing data? So we might want to drop those columns because they're not useful. Here we can see when we take our data frame to use the .isNA, the sum of those, multiply them by 100 and divide by the number of points, you'll end up with a percentage of missing data for each of these columns. So you have like network device, quite missing. You have state text. These are things that these are columns that are not really available in your data set. So we can drop those columns. That's something that's pretty common to do. And then what happens is we end up with this database that has all of our points, and we've merged our point list with our equipment list, with our buildings list. We have a really nice data frame with all the metadata we possibly could want. And we're going to export that. So we use the .toCSV to export this data frame as a CSV file. And then what that does is if in this database or this data set, you'll notice that there is now a file here. And of course you have access to this this data set on Kaggle, so you can download this file and explore it in Excel if you want to. It's not, it's not crucial to do that because you can use Python programmatically, but we've done it here for you so you can kind of see how this process works. You can see the file, you can play with it. And if you're learning how to interact with the metadata on the API, you can create your own files if you want to, that you can post-process in other types of tools. So the next video will in this series, on the last one in this series, we'll look at data visualization. So looking at the metadata, like visualizing the different types of metadata from the hackathon.